Megan Pinto is the author of Saints of Little Faith. Megan has received scholarships and fellowships from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing, the Port Townsend Writers Conference, Storyknife, the Peace Studio, and an Amy Award from Poets and Writers. Most recently, she received the 2023 Anne Halley Poetry Prize from the Massachusetts Review and was selected for Poets and Writers 2024 Get the Word Out Poetry Cohort. Megan lives in Brooklyn and holds an MFA in poetry from Warren Wilson. Tell me more about your grad school experience.
I went to Warren Wilson for my MFA in poetry, and I had a wonderful experience. I really feel like it showed me how to put poetry at the center of my life and the questions of poetry, and how to do that alongside having a full-time job, living in New York, having responsibilities. I went to grad school from ages 23 to 25. And Warren Wilson is a low residency MFA, which means that you go twice a year and there's a very intense, um, it's like camp, summer camp or winter camp. You go twice a year. And during that time, you also meet your mentor for the semester and you work with them one-on-one to establish your reading list, to establish your goals, and then you go off and you have a correspondence. So I guess it showed me how to be a writer.
Awesome. So, what were you doing before you got there? Were you doing a different graduate program or did you jump straight into this after undergrad?
I went to undergrad at Ohio Wesleyan. I studied English and theater, so really poetry and playwriting. And the year after college, I had an apprenticeship at the Purple Rose Theater Company in Chelsea, Michigan, which is a company that Jeff Daniels founded. And so the apprentices, we built the sets, we struck the sets, we cleaned the bathrooms, we like worked with the actors, we did everything. We did the laundry, and yeah, I it was a real education in like being an artist, and it just really affirmed for me that I wanted an artistic life. I wanted a life where I could make things and share them with people, and hopefully that people, yeah, that it could be a conversation of making and sharing and receiving. But that's what I was doing before. And then during my apprenticeship year, I applied to a couple different low residency programs.
That's really interesting. There's like this weird overlap between theater enthusiasts and poets, I've noticed,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
particularly among like the people I've interviewed. I've noticed
Oh,
that.
that's really interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like there's a mutual vulnerability perhaps, and like definitely an interest in like form and um I don't know, not maybe not confession, but sharing.
How long is the graduate program that you were in?
It's two to 3 years, depending. I did it in 2.5. I think the core program is 2 years, and I took an extra semester to work on my poems.
Tell me how Saints of Little Faith came to be.
Let's see. I graduated from Warren Wilson and I had a thesis, but I was able to look at that thesis and be like, cool, now I've learned how to write a poem. This is my thesis was great. This is not what I want my book to be. And then I just started writing. And at the time, I thought I was writing about my relationship to God and really exploring that. And I think I was. But what it turned into was also an exploration of my relationship with my father, with the women in my family. And really, I guess, I don't know, I think a central question is, what does it mean to love? What does it mean to give love and to receive love? How can we learn to receive love? So that, and I think the core poems of the book came together in about 4 years. And then once I got the acceptance from Four Way, there's a 2 year window in which to work on revisions, work with an editor. So that was a really nice period of time to to let the work mature, perhaps. Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you arrived at the title.
Yeah. Very, very analytically, methodically, perhaps, I wanted to submit to a chapbook contest. And so I was like, well, I've got to title these poems something. And I knew I was thinking about God. And I ended up just making a large list of any title that I liked. And then I grouped the titles into categories by themes. And then I sort of thought about the images from the titles. And I think from that, like saints or angels came about. And I think, yeah, once I sort of had the titles, the words, and then I was the images, I think the title sort of came to me and I was like, oh, this is it. And then, yeah, the title ended up working as a light at the end of the tunnel. It kind of helped me shape the book. And in trying to understand what the title wanted me to do, like why it came to me, I was able to, it helped me flesh out the manuscript.
Speaking of fleshing out the manuscript, can you talk a bit about how you arrived at the structure you chose?
Yeah, I thought so much about structure. I, again, I pulled down books I admired because I knew, I guess, when I was looking at the poems, okay, some poems are, um, I don't know, some poems are taking place at this particular time, or some poems have these concerns. And I started to think like, I really like books that work in sections. So I ended up looking at Tracy K. Smith's Life on Mars and then Voyage of the Sable Venus by Robin Costa Lewis. And I looked at a bunch, but those two I kept coming back to. And what I so admired were how the both books have sections, and each of the sections like is a dramatic shift in tone, in place, in register. And reading those books really energized me. And in a way, it really felt to me like the book as a whole was working as one big poem, which I kind of think all poetry books do. But I guess the way those sections were associating off each other was just really exciting to me. It felt like it mirrored the movement within some of the poems. So that, on one hand, that's how I came to it. And then on another level, just like working really practically, I would tape all the poems up on the wall and move them around, or I printed them all out note card size and I'd shuffle them and bring them on the train. And so I just spent a lot of time with them and I got really familiar. And so at some point it moved from more analytical to much more intuitive. And um, yeah, and then the final thing is I also did a read where I was like, does the last line of the poem connect in some way to the first line of the next poem? If it doesn't, is that working? Is that not working? Could that be a section break? So yeah, I think those are all the ways I sort of got to know the material on a book level.
That's so fascinating. And it makes me really excited to hear you talk about titling.
Yeah.
I noticed a lot of one-word titles in this collection, and I wondered if you could speak a bit on that. I know a lot of people struggle to title poems.
Yeah, they do. It's hard. I remember in grad school, I was like, oh, I turned in some drafts and they were untitled. And my teacher at the time was like, this isn't a painting. Like you've got to you've got to give it a title. Which is like not fair that artists get to say untitled number 72. But so for my titles, I again would look at the poems that I loved and then look at, okay, this is the material I love. This is how the poem's moving. What does the title give me as like as a scaffolding device? So by reading this title, what information is that giving me that launches me into the poem in a way that creates tension, creates surprise, is exciting? And also like what information do I need from the title to understand the poem? So with all that in mind, I also, I guess in terms of the one word title, this book is really image driven. My writing is image driven. I love images. And I think the one word came from that love of the image or just thinking about what is the concept? What is the the associative leap that we need to make that is big enough to hold all the movement of the individual poem together. And like an example of that is the poem Faith, which is a concept, but then the poem is, it's bringing in philosophy, the Bible, personal experience, imagining into other experiences. And in a way, I felt like if the poem's doing so much, the title can be simple and hopefully clear, uh, but then invite in the mystery that the poem is trying to explore.
So there's lots of rumination on time and its passage throughout these poems, school, coming of age. Could you talk a bit about how time functions in your work?
Yeah, I think that again, I love associative leaps. I love surprising turns. And I think that the interest in time, it came out of the work. It wasn't something I consciously thought I'm going to play around with this. It just kept happening. And I was like, oh, I guess, yeah, this is a big interest of mine. But in writing the book and in thinking about the coming of age themes that you talked about, I really see my work and like writing poems or writing the poems in this book as a way to be in a kind of conversation that exists outside of linear time. I'm talking to past selves, I'm talking to imagined selves, I'm talking to people that I've known who are now past. They can talk back to me, and poetry allows for a different kind of time. So I guess that's sort of like my conceptual thoughts about time and poetry. And in terms of the movement of time within the individual poems, because there's a lot of leaping, it's a way to think outside of our linear experience and bring together two moments or two stories that have resonance. But if we're just looking at things linearly, we might not make those connections. And I think that is such a beautiful thing we get to do with writing, and that's such a gift of the imagination to leap to make those connections. So I see now why it was such an interest of mine, and it's fun for me, and it surprises me.
I'm really curious to hear you respond to this question about memory then. So you write, each time we return to a memory, we change it. And this is similar to a question I had for Saba when I spoke to her.
Mhm.
Does this phenomenon at all concern you, that every time you return to a memory, it's different?
No, well, I don't think it concerns me. One is I do keep like diaries. I've always been like a journaler, a diarist. So I have some kind of record, but I think too, like memory is there for us to engage with. And memory is such a good mirror and teacher and really friend, but like a trickster friend perhaps. So I think that is the nature of memory to shift. And ultimately, I think when we remember, it is an imaginative act, or that we maybe retrieve memory with the imagination, and it's this kind of dance between um, what we think we know and whatever our current selves need to draw out to reflect upon. And yeah, I think the other gift of memory is that it is subjective, and there are other people who have experienced perhaps not exactly the same thing, but maybe were there at that time, that event. And so I think the the imperfection of memory is something that actually can connect us. And it is what makes us, it's part of what makes us storytellers, I think. So I think the curiosity and the imagination make me more excited than being precise or having a factual record.
I love that. I think that's a great answer.
Thank you.
On a similar note, you write, repetition is the rhythm of our grief, and you return to memories throughout the collection. How would you say repetition functions in your work and in your life?
Well, I'll start with poetry actually. So when we have repetition in a poem, uh, we're introduced to the idea, and then when we hear it and see it again, we're actually, is it going to change? Is it not going to change? We're alert. And each time it comes back, we're more and more sensitive to it. And then in a poem, usually it does change, something shifts. And that shift has great, not only intellectual meaning, but like sonic meaning. So as a poet, I love repetition. I think it's a great structural musical device. And then in terms of my life, I'm really interested in like we repeat ourselves, we repeat our patterns, we repeat behaviors until we're forced to change them, or we make a very conscious decision to change them. And again, just like poetry, that change usually carries great significance. And while I was writing the book, I was in my mid to late 20s, or really like mid 20s to early 30s, where I'm at now. And so much of that time, like my Saturn's return happened, you know what I mean? Like there was a lot of reckoning and a lot of really having to take a look at myself and say, what are my patterns? What do I want to change? I'm certainly repeating stuff because I keep getting the same results and I don't like them. So yeah, I think the interesting thing about repetition is when we become aware of it. And that's where the tension is. Now that I know, now that I see it, what am I going to do? And what does it mean?
That's fascinating. I'm going through that right now. My Saturn
Oh,
return.
you are? Yeah, I feel for you.
Lots of beautiful rumination on grief and illness. Curious to hear you speak about how they intersect with language. Like, how does poetry/language help you navigate grief and illness?
I love that question. So I write a lot about my father's psychotic break, that, as you know, because you read the book, that's the central section. And when he was in the hospital, when he was finally in the hospital, all I wanted to do, I would like go to the hospital, sit with him, and it was this like dark windowless room with this one painting. I think of the sea, it was blue. And I just remember like all I wanted to do was read. And so I went to Barnes and Noble that's next to my house, and I bought Amy Bender's The Butterfly Lampshade, which is like a novel in vignettes that's incredibly poetic. And the novel is about the main character whose name is escaping me. It starts out when she's 8, and her mother is having um, a psychotic episode. It might be schizophrenia. Something is happening, right? And it's retold. The daughter's on the phone with an aunt, and I like, I don't know, maybe some other person might be like, I want to read a novel that's about something totally different, or I want to watch TV. But in a way, language gave me a way to access my own experience. Reading that book and the form, like, clearly had a direct impact, at least to me, on the lyric essay that I wrote. It's vignette-like, it's short sections, it's more prosaic, and I don't know, I don't know if I would be able to have access that without that book or without another book. I'm thinking about at the beginning of one of Jack Gilbert's poetry collections, he has a dedication to Linda Gregg, and he says, it was like being alive twice. And I think about that with reading and writing, all like that dedication comes through my mind all the time. And it is like being alive twice. Like the first time there in the hospital room, I was so disconnected, but then I got like a second chance. I got to be alive again through the novel. And that kind of brought me back into my own experience. And I started writing again while my dad was in the hospital. And and none of it was conscious. I wasn't like, well, I'm going to read this book so I can write about it. So I think that's the other thing, with grief, illness, language, it's so much. But when I read and write, there's like so much joy, even when it's like difficult topics, which I would say this book is full of like perhaps difficult topics. But I don't know. I think it gives me agency. And I think to be able to make something out of suffering is like a very important thing that humans do. And that feels very important to me.
That's awesome. No, I think it was really well done,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
of course. Can you talk a bit about your relationship with your father and how that's like influenced your writing or your creative process? Because I'm sure like adding a person, especially a person in your family that you're close to, has an impact.
Yeah, I think when I started writing the book um I noticed it. I had this moment where I was like, I have no idea what I wrote. I have no idea how to talk about it. So I went back to old application essays for like fellowships and residencies. And one of the things I used to talk about was like the project of this book is writing into silence. And it's interesting, like when I think about knowing somebody when I was younger, I thought that meant like mutual self-disclosure and conversation. And I spent so much time with my dad. My dad would like use his lunch break to come pick me up from school and drive me home um and I think there was a lot of maybe what psychologists call like parallel play where like you're okay, like two people are doing a similar activity like a video game or but it's not like okay, now we're just like sharing our secrets. And so I it was interesting because my dad is reserved and very different from me. And and when he got sick especially, I just had this sense of like, who are you? I don't know you. And now I'm really angry because you're sick and maybe I'll never get to know you. And I think what I came through writing the book is a lot of acceptance that we don't always get what we want and we can't mold people into who we think they should be, but that doesn't take away from what they have given us or the time that we have spent together. My dad is also alive and healthy now. He, yeah, we ended up getting great medical care, so that's really exciting and a gift. But I think that's how, yeah, like now when I look back, it is sort of my childhood and adolescent and early 20s desire to know like why won't you tell me all these stories about your childhood and I think it's possible that that could happen, but you know I think I just have a lot more respect for everybody who's got to deal with the content and the material of their lives differently. And so the book is a way to write into those gaps. And to me, that also, again, that goes back to imagination as a way to have relationship, to be in relationship with someone. Um, and yeah, it's also really sweet. So my dad and my mom read my work when and I think this really helped me get to the point where I could publish the book. When I graduated grad school, I started finally sending out work for publication. And so whenever I publish a poem, I'd post on Instagram. I would post on Facebook, and my mom has Facebook, so my parents would eventually read the poem, and then they'd be like, "Oh, that was really beautiful." Or sometimes my dad would be like, "I didn't get it, but then I read it again and I got it." And I'd be like, "Oh, great." And that was kind of it. We didn't, and then we've never like dove into it, but I've I put it out there and they read it. And I think that now my parents are very proud that they've known that I've always loved writing. So I think the fact that I'm like writing and I have a book is really exciting to them and surprising probably, but like a happy surprise.
That's awesome. And I'm glad to hear that he's better.
Yes, thank you.
You bring up silence, and I think the whole like second or like the middle section is called Even in Silence. How would you say silence functions in poetry and life?
Well, in poetry, there's like, there's white space on the page. There's um, line breaks. There is the caesura. There are all of these ways that poets create silence, both orally and visually. Um, and I think, and that is a tool that helps mediate sound, like in the absence of sonic or yeah, like a sonic movement on the page or spoken out loud. There's there's this breathing room. Um, and I think that can be but what is said is just as important as what goes unsaid, both in poetry and in life. And I think just as I've, come of age, moved through my own understanding of things, I have a much greater appreciation for what is unsaid. Um, because I think the tension between what is said, what is unsaid, the spoken and the silence is like mystery and beauty, also sometimes confusion. Um, but in a poem in revision, we try to move away from confusion. We try to have the title that gives you enough scaffolding, the just the right amount of whatever needs to happen for that poem, that it's maybe clear what the subject is or clear something is clear. Um, but then the mystery is the I don't know, to me, I experience mystery as usually beauty and like a kind of warmth and wonder. So yeah, I think silence can be really powerful. And again, the project of the book, as I wrote a few years ago when I was applying to things, was to write into silence, to imagine into what has been left unsaid. Um, because I wanted maybe at first to know why, but I think what ultimately happened was I tried to make meaning for myself.
That makes a lot of sense. So throughout the book, I noticed a lot of, what is the word? I noticed this like fixation on sight and seeing,
Mhm.
watching. Can you talk a bit about how sight and seeing slash watching function in your life and in your creative practice?
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, I love the image and I I think I've always been observant and I've always written things down. Um, what I'm interested in the book is, and I think I have a poem that talks about this phrase, like clarity of sight. So maybe we're looking, but we're not really seeing or taking something in. Or if I'm perceiving something, how deep is my understanding? Do I know where the gaps are? And in my lack of understanding, can I get closer to someone or something? So I think I think perception is so subjective. Um, and it's not like I'm trying to get, I don't know, I'm not really trying to get at an objective truth because it's a book about the project is feeling and an emotional truth. But yeah, clarity of sight. How do we see others? And then ultimately, I guess, how do we see ourselves? Can we see ourselves clearly? Can we get better at seeing ourselves clearly? Can we look at ourselves with love, even though we're flawed? And the same for other people. Can we look with the eyes of love? The book and me as a person are really interested in that question.
It definitely comes through.
Oh, good.
You also mentioned conversations with psychics, which is a different kind of
Yeah.
seeing. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I love psychics. I think what I love so much is that psychics tend to speak in this like beautiful mythic language where um and I think all the psychics I've ever seen, which have been like I think three, um have are like very ethical psychics in that they all were like, what is the language that you're comfortable with me using? I'm not going to share anything you're not ready to hear. This is about giving you guidance to move on to your next step. And it is a kind of seeing. I'm not clairvoyant, but what I think is really useful to me is one, like whenever I see a psychic, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so ready to write a poem. But but two, that when I listen to somebody speak about my life in this mythic language, it's such a beautiful mirror, and it like confers so much meaning and dignity to my struggle, to the confusion in front of me. Um, and I think ultimately it just helps me reconnect with myself. And I think the moments where someone says something like they're looking at you both like here, but then here, and they say something and then it feels true, that is a kind of clarity that I'm interested in. And again, it's like mystery. Like I don't know how these people are able to look at me and say something that feels so resonant, but I don't have to know. And and that's fun. And I'm glad there are things that are beyond my understanding. So I think, yeah, I just love psychics. They are awesome. And I honestly feel like a part of my creative process, which is why they come up in the book. Because every time I would see one, I was like, time to write a poem.
I feel like they're one of those topics that just like there's no way you can not write a poem about them, right?
Totally. Yeah. You're like, wow, someone like foresaw my future love and like, I don't know, guided me away from destruction. That's the stuff of poems.
On a similar note, you write a lot about traveling throughout,
Mhm.
experiencing lots of things throughout the US and abroad. Can you talk a bit about how place and travel inform your work?
Yeah, I think I never traveled much as a child. I didn't really travel until college. My family probably took, I mean, we I grew up in North Carolina, so we would like take trips to the beach and stuff. But um it really wasn't until college where I studied abroad. I got to go to Mexico on a school trip. I and then after college, I was working, and so I could travel for work. And then I had my own money to go travel. And so I really think it was like a coming of age thing where I've always wanted to know how and why do people live the way they live. I think that's what drove me to read when I was young. And I think travel just, it was full of wonder. And it was like, wow, I've read about all these places and now I get to see them and experience them. And again, I think like psychics, it's just something that, you know, really fuels my imagination. And so it ends up showing up in the writing.
Last theme question. There's lots of hands and mentions of like touching and holding throughout, sometimes
Mhm.
coupled with violence. And I wondered how those concepts inform your work.
Yeah, I the hands thing is something that wasn't conscious. It just kept coming up. But I think, the poems are so interested in like loneliness and connection. So I think that's probably why. And hands are, again, to your point, they can be tender, they can be violent, they can be gentle or strong. So they're a great like image to work with. And then in terms of like violence, the book is really interested in violence, rage, um, suffering. And I I wanted to write the book that I needed to read. And so I also think though, like my writing, it it is, like sometimes you go see a movie with like a fight scene and it's like, Jesus Christ, I would have never imagined that. Like that was so horrific. Like I was watching House of Dragons and I was like, oh my God, why was that guy beheaded and why did I have to watch it all? And so anyway, and in writing the poems, like I think I actively try not to do that. Like I don't really want to go there and I don't want to show that to the reader, but I want to talk about the feeling. And so actually perhaps that's why hands come in because it's a way to communicate that tension, but really leave it open for like the reader's imagination to fill that gap in. And I find, when I'm reading about violence versus watching violence, the reading is always something where I'm able to connect with the depth of it. And even if I have to pause or like take a break, it's never the intensity of seeing it. And ultimately, I think that's something that is a bit trauma informed, perhaps therapy informed in my writing.
That's really
Maybe.
fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's something I thought a lot about because I didn't want to traumatize myself when writing the poems. And I think that was a way that I was able to work with my material, but then not be like, oh God, writing this poem was like watching Game of Thrones, which but like worse.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a concern there anytime you're writing about difficult things.
Yeah. I guess a question I have as a writer that I've always had is how do you write about difficult material? So again, allowing room for the reader's imagination to come in is one way that I found actually is really creating a relationship with the reader as opposed to being like, here's every graphic detail. So you don't need to imagine it in a way. You don't have to come in and fill it with your own experience, with your own images.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm so glad you mentioned that because I think it's a really important topic to discuss. But on that note, can we talk a bit more about your writing process and how you
Sure.
go about writing poems?
Yeah, just like my writing practice now.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I guess to go back to Warren Wilson in grad school. So I was working full time while I did that program, and I had this crazy schedule where I would wake up at like 5:30 and I would write. I would free write until maybe like 6:30, then I'd get ready for work and then I'd get on the train and I'd read on the train and I'd get to my desk by like 8. I'd work. I'd usually maybe I'd read or write at lunch or I'd take a walk and then I would take the train home and read and then I would make dinner and then I would write. So it was this like very monastic focused life. And then on the weekends I would like basically read and write all weekend. I don't do that anymore because I was working through specific like coursework and assignments. But what that experience taught me is like I can read and write anytime. And maybe it isn't always for like the length or the depth that I want, but I can like touch the work, I can touch the project. And in doing that each day, I can maintain my relationship with it. So now, like this summer's been busy as I've been prepping for the book and also just trying to see friends and, have a summer. So I usually I'll free write either in the morning or after work. Um, on the weekends, sometimes like on a Saturday or Sunday morning, I will just take a few hours and it's very luxurious. Like I'm not looking at the time, I don't have anywhere to be. And I'll either write by hand or I'll print out some poems and annotate them. Or sometimes if what I'm working on is ready, I'll take it back to the computer and I'll type it up. But yeah, and then I read on the train and before bed, or sometimes I'll read after dinner, and that's really nice. But mornings I usually can't read because I like have to go somewhere. I have somewhere to be.
What about revision? What are your best strategies for revision?
I love revision because I think revision is really where the writing happens. And the best strategy I have is time. Like I'll work on a poem and I'll work through it until I feel like I get it to a point where it's like, okay, this is as much as I can see. I've taken it as far as I can. Then I put it away in a metaphorical drawer because at that point it's usually on my computer. So I put it, I guess, in a folder and I don't come back to it until I've forgotten the sound, and I've like it's not hot in my brain anymore. And once it's cooled off, I can come back to it and look at it much more objectively and be like, oh, that line I was obsessed with like really has to go. Or, oh, this poem isn't working, but like let me just move these parts around, or it needs a new title. Like I'm just able to see it more clearly, I guess, to talk about sight. And yeah, I think time is the biggest aid in my revision practice.
That's what I hear over and over again from writers.
Yeah,
Time.
yeah. The other thing is I don't really do workshops for a long period of time. I've done a couple. I've been part of office hours, which was great. And that was a workshop that had both revision and then like writing time scheduled in. But at least right now, I think because I'm coming off of putting the book together and the material is so raw that I know it's not really ready to be looked at as a poem. I just have a friend or two that I exchange drafts with. Um, and sometimes the feedback is not like, oh, move this here, do this, but it's like, wow, I love this line. And so sometimes like revision is just about getting enough positive encouragement to keep going and having a body of work until you're ready to like dive in and look at it more critically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you have a favorite form?
I don't. I think that I love reading formal poems. I think in terms of my own writing, I will use form as like a generative. At least in the past book, I'd often like if I was stuck, I'd pick a form and then I'd try to write a poem in that form. And sometimes it'd stay closer to the form, but I was really giving myself permission to break form in my first book and like revise out of it to take what I need and just leave the scraps. But yeah, I think my favorite form is anytime I see a poem in form that's well done, and then I want to write it or I want to study it, and yeah, it inspires me.
Do you have a favorite poem in the book?
I think either the poem Faith, which I mentioned, which is a longer poem that I worked on for like over a year. I just couldn't get it right. Or not couldn't get it right. I was learning how to write past three-quarters of a page, which is the length I was comfortable with. And so that poem taught me a lot about writing longer poems, which the book certainly has some of. Or the poem Harvest, which talks about clarity of sight and um, perhaps what it means to receive love. I really enjoyed that poem. And that one came out of I had just come back from Bread Loaf, and it was really reflecting on like my friendships and how really friendship has been a great teacher in my life of what it means to give and receive love.
That's beautiful. What do you most hope people take away from the book?
That's a good question. I think what I hope is that people feel less alone. I think art is a language of souls, and it's this way to communicate essential information. It's a language of lyric intensity, and I hope the book, I guess, meets its readers. I hope that it makes it to the people that will be good readers of it and that will receive something from it. And I hope it has a good life. I feel like the next couple months with the book tour are really like pushing the boat out to sea, or it's like it's send off and it's sort of this ritual of like parting and like thanking it for what it's given me and taught me. It taught me that I can write a book and like realize a childhood dream. But yeah, like it's gonna go do its own thing and it's gonna have its own life. So I hope it has a good life.
I'm sure it will.
Thank you.
Can you give our viewers a prompt based on Saints of Little Faith?
Yes. Something I love to do, and I did a lot in my writing process, was every month or so, I would look at all of my old drafts and I'd pull all the language I didn't use, like the language I took out when I was making the poems, into a different document. And I would try to assemble a poem from the poem scraps. Because usually there's like a great image, a great line, a great something that gets cut out because it just isn't working for that poem. And by bringing all of those scraps into a new context, I was oftentimes able to generate a new poem. So that's what I would say. Like, once you're through a significant revision phase of your project, like sweep up all those language scraps and see if spend some time with them, see how they speak to each other, and see if that can turn into the beginning of a poem. And if not, perhaps just free write about what you think is missing. And I think either one of those will lead you somewhere, because that led me to the book. So it worked for me.
You kind of brought this up a little bit, but would you like to talk more about the submission process and how all that played out for you with this book?
Sure. Yeah. I submitted the book probably for a year and a half, but I guess the series submitting really only took 5 months. So about a year and a half before it was accepted, I had a book length manuscript. I was like, I think this is pretty close. And I just started sending it out. And I was like, I think it's going to get rejected. But if it doesn't, that'll be a happy surprise. Or maybe I'll get a nice rejection note. I didn't get either. It was just rejected, no nice note. But as when each time I'd send it out, I was confronted with the manuscript, and it just kept it top of mind. And I feel like it actually helped keep it alive. So I'd submit it and be like, I feel kind of lukewarm about the ending. And then I'd be like, oh, but I have these new poems. So I'd start reordering. And I did that for about a year and a half. And then the final version that got accepted, I remember feeling like this is done. I'd also participated in AWP's Writer to Writer program, and I worked with Neil Aitken, who was really wonderful and helped me kind of see that the new work I'd been writing was the book's true ending. And so, yeah, so after working with Neil, I sent it off to Four Ways open reading period, and then they accepted it. So that was wonderful. And the other, I guess, piece of information I'll share is that after it got accepted, I asked Ryan, who's the director of Four Way, why, like, oh, it's been rejected so many times from the contest. Why did you guys now accept it? And then Ryan was like, oh, we have totally different readers. Like, we'd never seen it before. And so I was like, great, that's like really good information. So now I tell all my friends, like, readers change. If a press has multiple contests and open reading periods, that doesn't mean the same people are looking at the same things. So, and that seems to have helped my friends. So I will share it in case it helps anyone who's listening, to just keep sending it out there and revising in between.
That's so interesting. I'm glad I asked. I had no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting.
So a question I always like to ask that I don't think we've really touched on is, how have you managed to maintain a writing practice outside of academia?
Yeah, I have a beautiful writing community. I live in Brooklyn, so there are a ton of writers here. Um, I write almost every day, even if it's for 3 minutes. Uh, Usually a bit more, but I don't put pressure on that writing. So I'm not like, oh, today I'm going to write a poem. Like, I journal every day for sure. And then I usually creatively write. Um, even if it's just like, oh, here's some images I saw, here's a list of images, here are a couple lines that are coming to mind after I read this evening. And I read almost every day. So I guess the way I maintain a practice is I just stay in touch with it. And it's a bit intuitive. I usually have a couple of days out of the month, usually up the weekend, where it's that expansive, not looking at the clock, just luxuriating in the process of writing. And I exchange work with close friends. who, yeah, sometimes are just like, this is awesome, keep going. And if I want more feedback, they'll give more feedback. And I go to readings. I try to support my friends. I read a lot of poetry. So yeah, I think those are all ways that I've maintained a practice that it feels really alive. It's kind of in some way woven into most parts of my day. And I have a lot of friends who are writers, which I feel really grateful for.
Speaking of writer friends, you did get an audience question from Kieran Bath.
Oh,
Wants-
lovely.
Yeah. Thank you for putting her on my radar, by the way.
For sure. She's amazing. And her book is so gorgeous.
Kieran asked, how do you reconcile the Megan the poems are about to Megan the poet today?
You know, honestly, this week I had a freak out where I was like, oh my God, people are going to read the book, which is like obviously the point of writing a book and the lifelong dream. But yeah, I don't know if I've really reconciled it. Maybe that's something that's happening as we speak and in this coming, between now and mid-September when the book comes out. I I think the book is at a really heightened register and it's a specific set of concerns. And, Megan, me now, like I'm like, what am I gonna eat for lunch? I need to go to the laundromat. Like I think I just as a person am not as focused on this one specific set of concerns, which is great because it means I can live my life and be silly and do mundane things. But I honestly think the coming fall with my book tour will teach me a lot about what it means to move my thinking and feeling into the public space. So maybe we'll have to check back in like 6 months or something. I think it's something I'm actively working through. But I guess what I'll say is I really believe that this experience of putting a book out is just going to teach me so much um, about how to be a writer and how to be a writer in the world and how to release something and let it go and also let readers have their own experience, whether it's positive or negative. Um, and I'm looking forward to that. I think that lesson will also be just part of a growing up lesson for me, the person, and me, the poet.
That's awesome. I think that's a great note to end on. But was there anything that I didn't touch on that you wanted to bring up?
No, I feel like it was a really comprehensive interview. The questions were so thoughtful.
Well, thank you. And I think you did a great job answering them. So,
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for these thoughtful questions and for taking the time, honestly, to interview me and to put this all together. It's such a thoughtful project. I really appreciate it.
no, I really enjoyed this and I can't wait to continue supporting you.